Just a few minutes early. Okay. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. Okay, welcome to lecture number 13. I had told you that I might record 13 and then do 14 today, and then next week do question and answer. I'm still going to do this. I'm going to record, but it turns out that 14 is longer than 13, so I thought it'd be better to do 13 here and record 14, just in case it does go over. I don't have the same time restraint. And then next week we'll do a question and answer. I don't yet know whether I'll put that on YouTube or not, but we'll see how it goes. If it's a horrible disaster, it won't happen. but if it's successful, we'll put it on. You know, that's the goal here. Is not to educate, not to inspire, but to make me look good. And so if it makes me look terrible, it won't go up. So what's that? Oh, yeah, exactly. Well, you never know what to expect with the questions. And if there's a whole bunch that I just don't know the answers to, it's not really worth putting up, but we'll see. So please encourage the other catechumens to come with questions. Obviously, the more questions we have, the more we can fill it up. If we don't go the full hour and a half, it's fine, you know, but at least a good hour-long session of questions would be a good idea. So in the last lecture, we spoke about how we approach church history, including some pointers on what to look for and what to look out for when you're studying church history. And we also talked quite a bit about the ecumenical councils, or the Holy and Ecumenical Synods, what prompted them, what they taught about Christ, who the heroes of each council was, how the holiness of the fathers present are what made them reliable, and how the ecumenical synods did not decide. If you remember, we said they don't decide what the church believes, but rather expresses in words what the church has always believed, so that people could guard themselves against heresy. And finally, we began our three-part series, which this will be part 2 of, discussing some major saints of the church. And the last time we discussed Saints Athanasius of Alexandria, St. John Chrysostom, St. Gregory the Theologian, St. Basil the Great, and St. Gregory of Nyssa. A little news on that, by the way. One of the catechumen books that's on the list, the first part of the list, the books to be read during the catechumenate, is On the Incarnation by St. Athanasius. Just this past week, it was placed on Audible with the translation that we use from St. Vladimir Seminary Press. And so that's kind of a nice little addition for those who like to listen to Audible books. Okay, so today we'll continue the series by discussing some of the great spiritual guides of the faith. And we have a lot to go through. We're going to go through 8 different figures. And that leaves a lot out, of course. There's many, many more we could talk about. But we'll take 8 that of names you're going to hear again and again, and maybe you already have through the Catechism, and we'll just briefly discuss in a very, very abbreviated way their lives, teachings, and in some cases what their influence in the church has been. So if we're going to talk about the great spiritual leaders of the church, those whose spirituality has had great influence on the way the church has lived, it would be a mistake not to start at least somewhere early in the list, which is where we'll start, with St. Anthony the Great. St. Anthony the Great is one of the most influential figures in church history for many reasons, which we'll discuss. So St. Anthony was born in 251 in Egypt, and he was born to pious Christian parents, which is a theme that you'll see again and again with many of these great spiritual leaders. At the age of 18 or 20, somewhere around there, his parents both died. About 6 months later, he was reflecting on the fact that the early Christians sold their possessions and gave the proceeds to the apostles when, as he's walking through the city, he's passing by this church and he hears the gospel being read. And what gospel is being read? The one that says, "If you would be perfect, go and sell all that you have and give it to the poor, and come and follow me, and you shall have treasure in heaven." This one hearing of this gospel lesson was so powerful for St. Anthony, he decided to direct his entire life towards Christ and to sell all that he had. So he had a sister. He gave the care of his sister over to a convent. He then took all of his possessions and he sold them all. And he went to the outskirts of the city to a small hut, and he survived on alms from that point on. He would visit the various ascetics living in the same way. And this was a common thing that was happening, is that a lot of ascetics would go to the outskirts of the city, they'd set up a small hut, and they'd live in asceticism. You know, Christianity is not yet formally legalized, but there are those who are trying to live a deeper ascetic life. Now, the idea of going deep into the desert was not common yet. This is why he was such a great saint. He's the first to really do this. But they would go right to the outskirts of the city. They may have a little handicraft that they'd work on. They'd sell it and base their lives on, or subsist on alms. And they'd pray and fast and live the spiritual life. And so what he did is he would go from hut to hut, and he'd spend as long as he needed to with any ascetic he found, and he'd find which virtue they excelled most in. And he'd learn that virtue from them, living the same way they did. And once he had mastered it, then he'd go on to the next one. And he'd learn from them a virtue and live it as much as he could until he had perfected it, and then on and on and on. There were terrible temptations that attacked him, of doubt, of returning to the world, and of lust. But an angel appeared to him and taught him to alternate prayer and work. He said, this is how you should live. You pray some, then go work some. Pray some and go work some. Go back and forth between these. He would fast greatly. He would eat only after sunset. And he began sleeping only every third day. So he really, really kept vigil as much as he could. And he would spend entire nights in prayer. He then went into the desert to a cemetery where he locked himself inside of a tomb. And he had a friend who would bring him provisions every few days. And demons began to physically appear to him and physically beat him. This is one of the things that you'll notice with a lot of these ascetics, is that after they've taken as many suggestions as they can to the mind, and the ascetic no longer listens to these suggestions, the demons will then take physical form and try to scare them away from the ascetic life. One day his friend found him near death, and he took St. Anthony, almost dead, to his home to recover. And when St. Anthony awoke, he used the little strength he had to crawl his way back to the tomb so he could continue in his ascetic fight. And this time, the demons took on the forms of wild beasts. But at the very last moment, right before St. Anthony was sure he was going to be beaten to death, a light opened up at the top of the tomb, and Christ appeared and drove all the demons away. And St. Anthony asked the logical question there, where were you this whole time? I'm almost dead. Where were you this entire time? And Christ replied, I was here, Anthony, but I wanted to see your struggle. Now, since you have not yielded, I shall always help you and make your name known throughout all the world. This is, if you go to Uncut Mountain Supply, there's a very beautiful icon with St. Anthony lying on the ground and that light appearing above him, and he's surrounded by all these different animals. It's one that I have at my home in our main prayer corner. It's a good reminder when I feel too tired to pray. You take one look at that and go, okay, I may be a little tired, but that's nothing compared to St. Anthony. I can stand and pray a little bit. So it's a good inspiration. Soon after this, at the age of about 35, St. Anthony decided to travel deeper within the desert. And again, this was an unknown ascetic practice at the time. He found a rundown fort by a river, and he locked himself inside. And his friend brought him bread just twice a year. Just 2 times a year, he'd come and bring him bread. He lived in seclusion for 20 years. He battled the demons constantly and the passions until he had obtained perfect dispassion and peace. Well, people began to discover him, and monastic communities began being built around him. So he became a guide to all. All these monks would live around him just to get a word every now and then. He could heal the sick. He could cast out demons. He was clairvoyant. People would come and he'd know their names. He'd know their questions, the answers. He went back into the world only twice. Once during a period of persecution, he went to be martyred, but God preserved him. God wouldn't allow him to be martyred. He had more work to do to influence the church for hundreds and hundreds of years to come. He visited Christian prisoners. He strengthened them and cared for them. And the second time, he went to fight heresies that had come up, mainly Arianism. The well-educated heretics were shocked by his wisdom when it was well known that he himself was not well-educated. And in fact, we have good evidence that he was unlettered. He couldn't read. He couldn't write. We do have some epistles from him. Some suggest the epistles are not really from him. Others say, no, he dictated these, and that's a very likely scenario. He reposed at the age of 105 in 356, very peacefully. His main disciple, he had many great disciples who went on to become also great saints and great desert fathers. And now this had become, because of him, it became a standardized practice for these ascetics to go deep into the desert and form communities. And so that was really started by him. The idea of the desert fathers, as we always talk about, really began with St. Anthony in this way. But of all the great ascetic fathers, there's one disciple who is probably best known among his disciples, and that's someone we mentioned last time, St. Athanasius the Great, to whom he left his monastic mantle. And as we said last time, St. Athanasius wrote his life, including a very long ascetic section containing St. Anthony's teachings on battling the demons. This book, I think I mentioned last time, is mentioned in St. Augustine's book, The Confessions. It was a book that a couple of young men came across, and when they began reading it, they were completely inspired and decided to sell all that they had and go into the desert themselves. Well, that's a small example of something that was happening everywhere. St. Athanasius' life of St. Anthony became very, very popular. It was translated into different languages, and it was copied all over the place so that everyone knew of this great life. St. John Chrysostom even suggests that every Christian should read this work at some point. So St. Athanasius' fame indeed did spread. Of course, the most famous of the monasteries begun by Elder Ephrem in America is St. Anthony's down in Arizona. It's said that St. Anthony could be seen sometimes walking around the outskirts of the desert at that monastery. So this is a figure who has had a massive influence, and indeed, I would not be one to ever disagree with St. John Chrysostom. Read his life if you've never read the life of St. Anthony the Great. It's in a few different translations. You can find one from St. Anthony's Monastery in Arizona. I know has published one of the versions. I think it's in their Lives of the Desert Fathers. There's one by Ancient Christian Writers series, did one that's a good translation, and then Classics of Western Christianity also has a version. There may be some others floating out there, but those are the ones that I know about. So a few of the teachings of St. Anthony. These are from the Sayings of the Desert Fathers. Abba Anthony said, I saw all the snares of the enemy spread out over all the earth, and sign. I said, what could get through these? Then I heard a voice saying to me, humility. It's one of the most famous of his sayings. Another one. When the same Abba Anthony considered the depths of God's judgments, he asked, Lord, how is it that some die after a short life, while others live on to ripe old age? And why are some people poor and others rich? And why do the unjust get or become wealthy, whereas the righteous are often poor? And he heard a voice saying, Anthony, pay attention to yourself. These things are the judgment of God, and it is not in your interest to learn about them. I remember the first time I read that, I was excited by the question. Yes, I want to know the depths of God's wisdom. And then I read the answer, and I was disappointed. But over time, I've actually found that's a very fulfilling answer. Indeed, we can give these things over to God and just relax, know that God is taking care of these things, and God knows what's best for the salvation of mankind. He said also, life and death is from our neighbor. If we gain our brother, we gain God. But if we scandalize our brother, we have sinned against Christ. It's a really amazing saying coming from someone who lived as a hermit for so many years of his life. Another, Abba Anthony said, a time is coming. This was one of my absolute favorites. I bring this up all the time because I think it describes our age. Abba Anthony said, a time is coming when men will go mad. And when they see someone who is not mad, they will attack him, saying, you are mad. You are not like us. That's today. The world has gone crazy. When they see those who are not crazy, they say, you're crazy because you're not like us. One more. Brothers came to Abba Anthony. Abba, by the way, is just the name for father that they use. Father Anthony. It's a kind of an endearing term. Brothers came to Abba Anthony and said to him, a saying from Leviticus. So the elder went out into the desert, and Abba Amonos followed him secretly, knowing his usual practice. He wants to find out how is he going to find the answer to this, so he follows him. The elder went very far, standing for prayer, and cried out in a loud voice, O God, send Moses, and he will teach me the saying. And a voice came to him speaking with him. So Abba Amonos said that though he heard the voice speaking with him, he could not learn the word from it. Just shows you the great spiritual height of St. Anthony, that when he didn't know the answer to something, he would go deep into the desert out of humility so no one would see him. And he'd cry out to Christ, and Christ would send the one to bring him the answer. It's an amazing thing. So as I said, there was an explosion of desert fathers and desert monasticism because of the life of St. Anthony. Even for those who hadn't read his life, news about his life and his miracles spread very quickly. This is one of the things that I mention a lot. I think I've mentioned it in the Catechism before. I could be wrong, but that there's really no explanation for the explosion of monasticism if it weren't for his miraculous life. People would go out to meet him and find out, oh, he's not miraculous at all. and they would probably just walk back to this. That didn't happen. What happened is people went and they stayed, and large communities went up all around St. Anthony, and he continued to instruct them. So if you want to read about St. Anthony, again, you should read The Life of St. Anthony by St. Athanasius, and you can also look to the lives and the sayings of the Desert Fathers, and you'll find a lot of his sayings and a lot of stories about him. Okay, the second for today, St. John Climacus. There's very little known about his origins. He was probably born about the year 570, so this is quite a bit later than St. Anthony. He went to Mount Sinai when he was about 16 years old only, and he submitted himself to an Abba Martyrius. At the age of 20, he was tonsured, and a fellow monk prophesied that he would be a great luminary of the entire church. He remained in obedience for 19 years until Abba Martyrius' death, and he went and lived the next 40 years in solitude, in prayer, fasting, and in shedding many tears of repentance. He began to display works of grace and showed forth great wisdom, so people began flocking to him for advice, as they had done with St. Anthony. After those 40 years, he was chosen as the new abbot. And this was a little bit strange because at the time, he was 75 years old. They didn't typically pick somebody who was that old to be abbot, but they all recognized that he was the greatest among them. And he remained in that role for just 4 years, where he showed gifts of clairvoyance and wonder-working. A fellow abbot asked him to write about the spiritual life, so in obedience, he wrote a book called The Ladder of Divine Ascent, and that's why we're talking about him today, in which he describes the progress of the Christian in 30 steps. Steps having to do with either the acquisition of a virtue or others with the instruction of victory over passions. So he's commemorated twice each year, first on March 30th, and then the fourth Sunday of Great and Holy Lent is dedicated to St. John and in his book, The Ladder. So Climacus was not his last name. St. Climacus actually means in Greek, of the ladder. So he was given this title because of this book, The Ladder of Divine Ascent. So a few words on reading The Ladder. A lot of people will come to me and ask, can I read this during Lent? And some parishioners and many Christians I know make this a yearly practice. Many monasteries do this, where they read the entirety of The Ladder of Divine Ascent every year. It is absolutely full of ascetic wisdom, great sayings, and very profound and moving stories of the spiritual life. Very inspiring. But my recommendation to most people is, especially to begin with, it's really not meant to be read cover to cover, as if you're, this is like your evening reading. You hop into bed, put your nightcap on. I don't know, and I don't think anyone wears nightcaps anymore, but and sit there and just read it casually. It's really, it's a good guide even for the layman, not just for the monastic, but it has to be placed in this proper context. And it's deep ascetic literature. And so it's really a book that I recommend, although it's fine to try to read it from beginning to end one time, then you really want to mark down, especially the pages that you find inspiring, but also look at the chapter headings and find out, okay, which thing do I really need to work on and which do I want to work on right now? And it's a good idea just to go chapter by chapter and just kind of look at it in that sense. I need guidance on this particular issue. So a few quotes. I mean, I could probably pick out 100 quotes from this book that are inspiring, but just 3 of them for time's sake. It is not the one who reproaches himself who shows humility, for who will not put up with himself? It is rather the one who is slandered by another and yet continues to show love for him. That's a great saying on what true humility looks like. 2, whoever is proud of his natural gifts, intelligence, learning, skill in reading, clear enunciation, and other similar qualities, which are acquired without much labor, will never obtain supernatural gifts. Whoever is not faithful in small things is also unfaithful in large things, and is vainglorious. So we have to watch out for this. This is very common today. We've all, I'm sure, experienced this, where we get very proud of ourselves for things we didn't have to struggle for in the first place. Just natural gifts. He says, yeah, don't do that. Take care of those small things, but then if you're not going to take care of those and offer glory to God, God can't give you the great things because you can't even handle the small things without it becoming harmful to your soul. And this last one. It often happens that God humbles the vainglorious, sending a sudden misfortune. If prayer does not destroy a proud thought, we bring to mind the departure of the soul from this life. And if this does not help, let us fear the shame which follows dishonor. For whoever humbles himself shall be exalted, and whoever exalts himself shall be humbled. Luke 14:11. When those who praise us, or rather seduce us, start to praise us, Let us recall our many sins. Then we shall find that we are not worthy of what they are saying, and they act or do to honor us, whatever they say or do to honor us. So I looked up various quotes from St. John Climacus. They all had to do with humility at the time, and I found them all inspiring. So he obviously covers a large array of things. There are a couple versions of this available in different translations, but the one I recommend is the one from Holy Transfiguration Monastery. That's really the ideal one. We do have it in the bookstore. And it's a good one for every Christian to have, even if you don't read it from start to finish. Again, if you're struggling with a certain passion, you can look at that chapter. And he basically just compiles all this wisdom that he had collected from his readings and from his own experience and from the monastics around him, because he compiled a lot of stories of what had happened to those around him, and a lot of them were quite miraculous. And so it's a great book to have on your shelf. Again, I consider it more for reference than a book you're just going to read cover to cover, but to read it cover to cover once, one Lent, I think it's a fine thing to do. Just know what you're reading. You're reading deep monastic literature, but the Church, in her wisdom, the Fathers said, there's so much wisdom in this that we'll dedicate an entire Sunday of Great and Holy Lent to St. John Climacus, because all people can benefit from this book. Okay, the third one is lesser known. I think his veneration has grown quite a bit, and deservedly so. And I wish he were even better known. It's interesting, we mentioned St. Anthony's Monastery in Arizona. If you continue to go south and a little southeast, I think, there's a women's monastery named St. Paisios. And a lot of people assume it's the modern St. Paisios. It's not. It's actually this St. Paisios. St. Paisios Velichikovsky. St. Paisios Velichikovsky. This is a much, much later figure in the Church. He was born in 1722 in Russia. He was the 11th of 12 children of a priest. So his father was a priest. There were 12 children. He was number 11. Now, why am I bringing him up? He very much revitalized monasticism and a lot of Orthodox practices in all of the East, and his influence continues to be felt today. So what happened in his life? At the age of 17, he decided to become a monk and sought out a great spiritual guide. But every time he'd go to a monastery, he realized, well, they're teaching me the basic gospel precepts, which is good. They're teaching me to follow the commandments of Christ, that's good. But the deeper things of prayer and how to really be perfected in heart, I can't really find here. And so while he searched for a great elder, he moved from one monastery to another, to another, to another, and this went on for 7 years without feeling drawn to anyone in particular. Often he was such a great monk, they didn't want him to leave, and so he would have to kind of sneak out in the middle of the night. Normally when you're made a monk or a nun, you're made it in that monastery for life. But he felt a true call from God that he had to find something where he was going to learn the deeper things of the spiritual life. So a little story about this. He went to Kiev, one of the most famous places of Orthodox monasticism, where he happened to meet his sister-in-law, the widow of his older brother, Archpriest John. She informed him of his mother's sorrow when he left Kiev, and his mother's mind seemed to be affected by her grief. And then one day an angel appeared to her, to his mother, and told her that instead of loving the Creator with all of her heart and soul, she loved his creation more, her own son. Basically, stop grieving so much because your son has dedicated himself to God, and this is actually great glory for you, not something you should be sad about. Because of this excessive love, the angel continued, she was thinking of starving herself to death, which would result in eternal condemnation. The angel said that by God's grace, her son would become a monk and that she should also renounce the world and become a nun herself. So after this, she became calm, and she accepted this as God's will. So she entered a convent and was tonsured with the name Juliana. And after 10 years or so, she departed to the Lord. So the angel is guaranteeing that this was a good decision by St. Paisios, and even encourages his mother to go and become a nun herself, which is showing that there's a divine favor upon him even early on. So he had a will of iron, shall we say, when it came to the monastic life. He believed that if he was going to please Christ, he needed to be as perfect as possible. This is something that sometimes you get this with saints who have this will of iron, where they will charge forward in every little thing, and if they make one little mistake, they make a really big deal out of it in their own life. Well, this happened with him. One day he was while he was sleeping, the church bells, the call to prayer, began to ring out. But he didn't hear it. And so he slept through this. And he slept through for only, a short while. And when he woke up, he realized, oh my goodness, they're already in church praying. And he ran to the church and he was weeping inconsolably. And all the other monks were like, we've all done this. This is not that big of a deal. And even the abbot was like, just calm down. Like, you slept through 10 minutes of a service. This is not a big deal. But he said, no, I refuse to give myself any slack whatsoever. And so from then on, for the rest of his life, he refused to sleep lying down. He would sleep only leaning against a wall because he felt that this was a betrayal of Christ. Now, this could be seen by the world as being absolutely crazy. We look at that and go, this guy's he's not healthy. But because he had so much grace with him, there was a health to this. But it's a health that not all of us can live. We can't live that extreme nature of the spiritual life, at least not that early. So this is the way he approached monasticism, and you can see the will with which he wanted to follow Christ as best he could. So after going from one monastery to another, he really began progressing quickly anyway. He learned to overcome the passions and the demons, and he began gaining the practice of unceasing prayer, even though he had no one to teach him this practice. So at the age of 24, he decided to go to Mount Athos, and he continued to search for a great spiritual guide. But eventually, a fellow monk of his, who started traveling with him and seeking for this great elder as well, after some time, this monk looked at him and he said, every time I have a question, you have the answer. You're already advanced in this. Why should I seek any further? You be my guide. You can be the elder. And St. Paisius, of course, refused. There's no way. There's no way. So what did this monk do? His companion, for 3 days, continued to weep and beg him. And finally, after 3 days of this, he accepted this as the will of God and agreed to take on his friend as at least a fellow struggler and teach him some of what he had learned in the spiritual life. Well, eventually, other monks began to join him, and after many refusals, St. Paisius agreed to be ordained and to become their confessor. So what did he do during this time besides living the spiritual life? He stayed in the Mount Athos for 17 years, and during those 17 years, he began seeking out, if he couldn't find a great elder to lead them, and if they were going to make him the elder, he began seeking the writings of the great saints of ancient times who had written about the depth of prayer. And he found various manuscripts, and he would find them and collect the same ones from different places and find where mistakes had been made in translation or just in copying, and he began correcting them, and he began compiling all of these writings on true prayer. So eventually he moved off of Mount Athos and went to Moldavia, where many, many more monks joined him. After 12 years there were 350 monks under his care. And here he began correcting the Slavic translations that he could find of the fathers based on his work on Mount Athos with the Greek texts. So he began comparing the Greek and the Slavic texts and correcting them. And after correcting them, these would then be published and copied out and sent to other monasteries all around. He made 2 more moves. First, he went to Secu Monastery in Romania, and he was there for a few years when the prince wrote to him and said, you need to go to the nearby Neamț Monastery because it has a lot more space. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. We've made a good home in Secu. We like it here. And the prince said, be obedient. Okay, fine. It's always a good way to get a monk to do what you want. Be obedient. I'm the prince, do what I say. So he moved everyone, and he spent his last 15 years there at Neamț working on translations and correcting manuscripts. These monasteries are not far apart, by the way. I've actually been there a couple times. It's in the Moldavian part of Romania, or near it. So if you go to Neamț Monastery, you can just drive maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes, I forget exactly how long it is, and drive to Secu, and then you drive a little bit further and you go to another famous monastery that's famous now, Sihăstria, where the great elder Cleopa, who reposed in 1998, struggled and is buried, among many other great figures. And so it's like this amazing thing that just, you could probably walk it in a day, and here you have these 3 very famous and great monasteries. So he spent the last 15 years at Neamț working on translations and correcting manuscripts and guiding the monks. Around the time of his death in 1794, there were about 1,000 monks under his care. This is a huge undertaking. His relics remain at Neamț, where they're incorrupt to this day. Again, I've gone to venerate them. If you haven't seen yet Incorrupt Relics in the book by Elder Cleopa, who I just mentioned, The Truths of Our Faith, there's a really nice picture in there of the incorrupt right hand of, I think is it St. John the Baptist or St. John Chrysostom? I can't remember, but you can also see they have the skull of St. John Chrysostom with his right ear, which is it's still intact. That's the ear that St. Paul used to whisper into when he'd write his commentaries. If you've never seen Incorrupt Relics, people look at them and immediately they think, oh, it kind of looks like it's mummified. But the difference is that there's actually no embalming whatsoever. There's no preparation for the body. It's grace that preserves it, and many, many miracles happen there. And so it's an incredible thing to go to Niamps and see this entire tomb with all the silver, and they have a cutout where you can kiss the hand of St. Paisios, which was just like an amazing thing to be able to do. He's commemorated on November 15th, so just a couple weeks ago. Again, the monastery in Arizona is named after him. So again, why such a big deal? Why is St. Paisios Velicica? And I'll also tell you, in English, I think there are, that I know of, 3 separate lives of him written. It's amazing he's still not that well known, but St. Herman of Alaska Monastery has written a very nice life of his. You can find the original life in kind of an obscure series about like Ukrainian and Russian spirituality. I forget exactly what it's called. And then there's one by Father Sergius Chetverikov, who wrote a nice life of St. Paisios. They're all very inspiring and very incredible, but his legacy is not in. A lot of people still don't know his life that well, and he didn't write very much. He wrote a bit, and you can get that again from St. Herman of Alaska Monastery. They have a little series called the Little Russian Philokalia, and one of the volumes is dedicated to St. Paisios and has some of his writings in it. But the main reason that he's so venerated is that he had so many disciples, and there were so many writings that he popularized from the church from hundreds of years before him that they spread out. And Hesychism, that idea of unceasing prayer with the prayer open, the Jesus prayer, that became very popularized because of him, and it spread like a spider web all over the place. And so wherever you went, you could find someone who was a disciple of St. Paisios, either directly or was a disciple of one of his disciples. And so because of him, Orthodox monasticism was revitalized over the entire East, and then it spread out to the entire world. And so much of, basically you could say all of monasticism today really owes its legacy to this one man. This one man revitalized everything. Again, with that incredible will of iron where he sought to please God in all that he did. He lived an incredible ascetic life, but he was also a man of a personality that was just ripe to be able to copy all these manuscripts and guide so many people and really revitalize it for the entire world. So a really incredible and important figure that ought to be better known than he is. Okay, next, number 4, Saint Nicodemus the Hagiorite, or Nicodemus is what we say in English. In Greek, it's Nicodemus. That's what I've always said ever since seminary, so I'm stuck in it. So sorry if that sounds strange to you, but that's what I'm calling him. So Saint Nicodemus of Mount Athos. I don't really have a lot to tell you about his life, but I want you to know his name, and you'll understand why in a second. He was born in 1748 in Naxos, Greece. He studied many languages and showed profound intellect at a young age. At the age of 26, he went to Mount Athos, and under the guidance of Saint Macarius of Corinth, who recognized Saint Nicodemus' great brilliance and focus, Nicodemus began editing manuscripts of various practical, ascetical and hesychistic works of the fathers of the 4th to 15th centuries that would later become known as the Philokalia. So these are a lot of the same things that St. Paisios Velicikovsky was working on. But St. Nicodemus and St. Macarius of Corinth got together and actually compiled them. And so when you read The Way of a Pilgrim, and it mentions the Philokalia, which means love of wisdom, this is the collected works that we're talking about. He had the scriptures memorized, including chapter and verse. He also heavily edited another very famous work. It was actually a Catholic ascetic work, but he heavily edited it. It's called Unseen Warfare by, I think it's Lorenzo Scupoli, which is available today in English. It was edited first by St. Nicodemus and then by St. Theophan the Recluse, who we'll talk about. He compiled a full book with commentary of all the canons of the church. He had a great love for the lives of the saints and made a new 3-volume set of the lives of the saints, what we call the Synaxarion. He wrote many other things, especially instructions to priests, the most famous work being called the Exomologatarion, which is a guide for confession for priests. It's not one that you're going to go and read on your own, but like every priest has this. And he reposed in 1809 at the age of 60, commemorated on July 14th. So again, not a whole lot about his life. I actually would like to read more about his life. I don't know a whole lot about it, but it's important that we mention him because you're going to see him mentioned a lot. He really compiled and you could say systematized, in a sense, a lot of the ascetical wisdom and moral teachings of the church. But the main thing to know is that this is the one who compiled all these writings, mainly on prayer, although there are on other things as well, into what's called the Philokalia. And you can get the Philokalia today. There is I think the first 4 volumes, I forget the publisher, I think it's Faber and Faber, but I could be wrong. And then there's a 5th volume that was actually just translated recently by St. George Monastery. And then there's also one by, there's a man named Constantine Kavarnos, who reposed a few years back now. And he was in Boston, he was a Greek scholar, and he didn't really like the translations that they'd come out with. And so he started making his own translations and reordering them. So the Philokalia that you normally see is ordered from most ancient to the most recent writings. And he said, no, nobody actually reads it that way. No, even the monks don't read it that way. And so he started writing it with the simplest stuff first. And he only came out with 2 volumes. They're not that easy to find right now. But those are very good translations. And he kind of had his own reasons for why he wanted to retranslate them. So you can find these. But if you find Kavarnos's versions, I think that's the best place to start. It starts with the simplest stuff. Okay, so I mentioned St. Theophan the Recluse, number 5 for today. He was born in 1815. He attended a military academy and then the theological academy at Kiev. He was tonsured a monk before his studies were done. He was widely recognized for his great piety and his brilliance, and so he was made the rector or the head priest of a couple different church schools and seminaries, as well as a teacher. He wasn't happy with academic work, though, and he was sent to Jerusalem and Constantinople, but eventually was recalled to Russia. In 1859, he was made a bishop. He was very, very gentle with the people. He had a priest to whom he assigned the task of dealing with difficult worldly situations in which someone had to be reprimanded. He didn't like to reprimand anyone, so he had a priest to do that for him because he was so gentle with the people. But he was only a bishop for 7 years. And the reason for that is after 7 years, he asked to be relieved of his duties. He was made the superior of Vishnu Monastery, but he soon resigned from this as well. So why? It's because he loved the solitary life so much. This is why he's known as Saint Theophan the Recluse. He wanted to live his own spiritual life deeply, and he found that all the work that he had to do was distracting him from his own love for Christ. For 6 years, he attended all the monastic services, and then he built a small cell for reclusion and served Sundays and major feast days in a small chapel. And he cut off all relations that he had except for that with his own confessor. So this is where he lives his life of reclusion. For the final 11 years of his life, he himself served services daily on his own. He wrote many works, and he answered a lot of letters. He also translated the Philokalia and the works of St. Simeon. He painted icons in some of his time and worked as a carpenter. And he reposed at the age of 79 in 1894. The reason I mention his is because his works are so important. Essentially what St. Theophan did is he said, I don't want to do anything that's innovative. I don't want to do anything that's new. Everything I write you can find in people before me. However, he recognized that people of his time were not able to really grasp the basics of the spiritual life from reading the ancient fathers because they were just so exalted and they wrote in such an exalted way. And so what he did is he took all the patristic wisdom before him and made it accessible. And that was really his goal. Just how can I make the patristic wisdom of ancient times more accessible to people of our age? So the 2 works that I would really recommend reading the most, the first is called The Path to Salvation. This is published by St. Paisius Monastery in Arizona. And second one, also published by them, is The Spiritual Life and How to Be Attuned to It. I think I showed and talked about in an earlier lecture that The Spiritual Life and How to Be Attuned to It is a series of letters that he wrote to one of his spiritual daughters. And the first 13 chapters, he discusses kind of the makeup of the soul and how we can direct the aspects of the soul towards a life of worldliness or towards the spiritual life. And it's really not as systematic as I think in our times, we want things even more simplified. And so I have on the church website, you can find a document that summarizes the first 13 chapters. I'm telling you this because a lot of people read this book. They get the book, The Spiritual Life and How to Be Attuned to It, and they get lost in that first 13 chapters. They go, this is too difficult. I don't want to read it anymore. And I recommend don't do that. Push through, have this little guide next to you that I wrote, and after that, it gets simpler. It gets much simpler. So don't get lost in that first 13 chapters and just give up. Both of these works are well worth it. The path to salvation really goes from, as an infant, how do you live the Christian life, all the way through your whole entire life. And so these have become very, very influential books for Orthodox Christians, and that's why we have St. Theophan the Recluse on there. He also further revised Unseen Warfare, that book that we talked about that St. Nicodemus had revised from Scupoli, and he wrote some other works as well. Little by little, they're being translated. One of the ones that I've been meaning to read for a couple of years now and I haven't gotten to yet, God willing I will soon, Psalm 118 is by far the longest psalm, and he has a whole book that's just a commentary on that one psalm. And I've read excerpts of it, and it always makes me want to read it so badly, but I get distracted easily with other readings, so eventually I'll read it. You can also find from St. Herman's Monastery, there's a book called Thoughts for Each Day of the Year, or Every Day of the Year, something like that. And it gives the epistle and gospel lesson for the day. And he just gives a little blurb, something to think about. It's a great daily devotional. Okay, the next absolutely massively popular saint, Saint Seraphim of Sarov. If you go to the back of the church on one of the podiums there, you see Saint Seraphim of Sarov. When you walk into the church, it's on the left. So from my perspective, it's on the right over there. He's one of the most beloved saints of the entire church. He was born in 1759 in Kursk, Russia. At the age of 10, he became seriously ill. They weren't sure that he would survive. After a lengthy illness, he saw the Mother of God in his sleep, and she promised to heal him. So some days later, there was a miracle-working icon of the Mother of God, which was being processed around the city, and they had to be rerouted, and it went right past his house. So as it was going past his house, his mother put Seraphim in her arms up to the icon, and immediately he began to recover. He soon recovered from this long illness. He spent much of his childhood in church and reading the lives of the saints and finding seclusion to pray, even as a young boy. At the age of 18, he decided to go and become a monk. Right from the start, he was highly dedicated. He prayed much, he ate very little, only once a day, and on Wednesdays and Fridays he would eat nothing. He slept very little. Not long after joining the monastery, he received a blessing to withdraw into the forest for prayer. But he became ill again, and he was forced to spend 3 years continually lying down. And the Theotokos appeared to him yet again, accompanied by other saints, and healed him. In this vision, the Theotokos spoke with the Apostle John the theologian, and she motioned to Saint Seraphim and said, "He is of our lineage. He's of the same type as us." In his late 20s, he was made a deacon. He would see angels while serving often, and once, while he was out, as deacons do, and they do the petitions out here, he was standing before the icon of Christ, and he saw Christ himself appear before the icon. The vision was so great that he was struck dumb, and he just stood still. And for a little while, the other monks thought that maybe he had just forgotten what to say next, but after a while, they realized something happened here. He saw some sort of vision because he just remained still and silent. And so they actually had to carry him out of the church, and so he could kind of recover from this great vision. After being made a hieromonk, monk, or a priest monk, he began going 5 kilometers into the forest to a small hermitage he had there. This is where you get a lot of the famous icons, one of the most famous stories. He had obtained such a purity of heart that the animals recognized this paradisical state in him. And so who was his friend? A bear. And the most famous story is that a nun came to visit him one day, and she saw this bear running towards him, and she screamed out, she said, "Oh, watch out, Father Seraphim, there's a bear coming!" And he goes, "What's the big deal?" And he pet the bear and fed it, and this was his friend. But the other famous thing there were 2 other really famous things that happened to him in this seclusion. One is a great ascetic feat. The other was a horrible, horrible travesty, but at the same time, it's so inspiring to hear how he dealt with this. What happened in that one? One day, there were a couple robbers who came to steal from him, and he explained that he had nothing. So, I'm a monk, I don't own anything. But they didn't believe him. And so, though he had an axe and was very strong himself, he laid the axe down and he crossed his arms and he said, Do whatever you must. And so they beat him. They beat him so badly that he was on the ground with blood pouring from his face, and they only stopped when they thought he was already dead. He was hunched over for the rest of his life after this. They beat him so severely, and a lot of the icons you'll see he uses the axe as a crutch. That's what he would do. Eventually, though, the men were caught. And so the authorities called St. Seraphim and asked to identify them and testify against them, and he refused. He refused to testify against them, but actually interceded to the judge on their behalf. So don't punish them so harshly. Let these men go, which are obviously, an amazing act of love, but also very influential for those men. Soon after this, his life says that he fell into some sort of sin. We don't know what it was, although there's some evidence that he just had a judgmental thought. Maybe it was just simply that. And so that's when he took on this third very famous story from this time in reclusion. He began a 1,000-day ascetic feat of spending all day kneeling on a rock with his arms outstretched and praying. He did this all day for 1,000 days. Eventually, the Theotokos appeared to him again and told him to return to the monastery, but to shut himself up in his cell without seeing anybody. After some time, she appeared again and told him, open your door, but don't speak to anybody. Let people witness you. Don't speak to anybody. And finally, she appeared again and told him to begin seeing and counseling people as an elder. He would call people my joy all the time. This is how he'd greet them. And he would bow to them, and he'd kiss their hands. He was so humble. His most common piece of advice was, acquire the spirit of peace, the Holy Spirit, and thousands around you will be saved. This is the main way that we do evangelism as Orthodox Christians. The other very famous part of his life is that he went out into the forest one time in the snow and had a spiritual child named Motovilov, was his last name, and they had a conversation. And this has become written as on the acquisition of the Holy Spirit. And so what he talks about with Motovilov is, what is the purpose of the Christian life? And he says, we don't fast for fasting's sake. We don't even pray for prayer's sake. Rather, everything we do, everything the church gives us, is so that we can acquire the Holy Spirit. And he goes to this explanation, and during this conversation, he begins to shine brightly with the uncreated light of God, and Motovilov does actually in return as well. So you can get that conversation as a separate booklet in and of itself. You can also find it in, again, the Little Russian Philokalia from St. Herman's Monastery. There's one on St. Seraphim of Sarov. But I will tell you that there's also multiple lives available, which I'll mention in a minute about St. Seraphim. He had, despite his great spiritual heights that he had reached, he would give very simple advice for those who lived in the villages and towns, and they couldn't live the way that he lived. He said, keep the Wednesday and Friday fast and pray a little each day, and a certain level of perfection can be met even with just doing that simple stuff. Just pray every day a little bit, keep the Wednesday and Friday fast and the major fast of the church. He was clairvoyant. He advised people to be joyful. There were many, many miracles that happened in his life, and he had many, many holy spiritual children. There are many stories of his interactions with some of these spiritual children and some of the great works that he had worked. At one point, he was at a women's monastery that he founded and was the elder over, and he used his staff to strike a rock, and water began bubbling up, and now there's this miraculous spring that's been there to this day. He also wrote, interestingly enough, he wrote a letter to Tsar Nicholas II. Now, again, he was born in 1759. Tsar Nicholas II didn't come for quite some time afterwards, but it's speculated that in this letter, he prophesied what was going to happen to Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution, because it said that Tsar Nicholas and his family read this letter and were just like in stunned silence, like almost white-faced when they read it. But they took his advice. How could you not take the advice of somebody who wrote 100 years before and told you what's going to happen? As I said, there are multiple lives available in English. I haven't read all of them, but the two that I would probably recommend the most from what I've read are St. Seraphim, Wonder Worker of Sarov by Helen Kontsevich. And that one I think is probably pretty tough to find. The one that's easy to find is called An Extraordinary Peace, St. Seraphim, Flame of Sarov by Archimandrite Lazarus Moore. He's the one who actually translated the Ladder of Divine Ascent. So I would definitely recommend every Orthodox Christian at some point should read at least one life of St. Seraphim of Sarov. You will be so inspired by him. I can't even describe it. He's become one of the most famous saints, and even those who are non-Orthodox read his life and are very inspired by him. So again, that's one that I would definitely recommend reading. Okay, we're actually doing better on time than I thought, which is good. Okay, the next is, although I'm going to talk about one of the individuals, it's really a series of saints known as the Optina Elders. Eventually, I'll talk about probably the most famous of them, St. Ambrose of Optina. But let me tell you who the Optina Elders are, because again, you're going to come across the name the Optina Elders, and I want you to have an understanding of who they are. In 1821, Optina Monastery, which is a monastery near a river in a deeply forested area about 160 miles outside of Moscow, began to be the home of a series of great ascetics and men of prayer that would come to be known as the Optina Elders. In all, there was a line of 14 saints from this tradition, and it ended only because communism shut down the monastery. This included the abbots so there's the main monastery of Optina, and then there's the hermitage, the Optina Hermitage, which you'd go deeper into the forest, not far from it at all. You can actually see this on like Google Earth or something, and you can see, there's the main monastery, and then there's this strip of forest, and then there's a smaller monastery. And that smaller monastery became the home of many of these great elders. So there would be abbots of the main monastery or the hermitage, and elders. And the elders had a different role than the abbot. The abbots were really administrative guides. The elders were spiritual guides. And they were spiritual guides not only to the monks, but because of their fame, beginning with Saint Leonid of Optina, because of their fame, many people from all over Russia began hearing about them and flocking to this monastery, and it became one of the main spiritual centers in all of Russia during this time. It was based in the tradition of St. Paisius Velichakovsky. Again, some of the first elders and some of the first monastics there were disciples of St. Paisius. So you see how the fingers of his influence have begun to spread. The first who were there, the brothers St. Moses and Anthony, had come from the monastery come from monasteries headed by direct disciples of St. Paisius. So again, they were disciples of disciples. And the website, if you go to the website of St. Paisius Monastery in Arizona, there's a really, really great article. I mean, it's so wonderfully written, and it's a little bit lengthy, but it's not daunting really. It's not. It's a great article that goes to the entire history of Optina with these, and it goes over all 14 of these personalities. And it doesn't go into so much detail that then again it's overwhelming, but it goes into enough that it's very, very inspiring. And so if you look on our website, there is in one of the older pages on the Catechism, you can find a link to this. I'll try to add it to the YouTube video if I remember. St. Herman Press has published 9 volumes of the lives of the Optina elders. Holy Transfiguration Monastery has published 2 others, so there's 11 of the 14 that are in English. And volume 4 in the St. Herman Press series is on the most famous of these elders, or in Russia it's called a starets, the God-bearing elder St. Ambrose of Optina. So I want to tell you about St. Ambrose and his life. In our reading group, we're actually reading his life right now. So if I know we've had quite a few copies of it, it's well worth your time reading it. It also has a great chapter that goes over the history before St. Ambrose of what led to Optina becoming so famous. So, St. Ambrose. St. Ambrose was born in 1812 into a priestly family. He was also very well educated, like many of the ones we've talked about. He went to seminary where he excelled and was among the top of his class, but he had no intention of becoming a priest or a monk. A year after his graduation, he became very ill. And so in his deep illness, realizing that he might be near death, he made a promise to God. He said, "If you make me well, I will serve you. I will serve you. I'll find a way to become a priest or a monk, and I'll serve you." And this, I find this very comforting to know that he's one of the greatest of the Optina elders. He was made well, and he completely forgot his promise and just forgot about it. And so he had not the best start to his spiritual life. In 1839, he visited a very well-known elder named Hilarion. And Hilarion told him, "You need to go to Optina. They have need of you there. They have great need of you." And so what did he do? He ignored it, which makes me really feel good about my spiritual life. He ignored it again. And he ignored many signs from God until one night, after an evening of jokes and frivolity with all of his friends, his conscience suddenly weighed on him very, very heavily. And he kind of took a look at himself and said, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" So the very next day, he quit his teaching position, which was a very good one, and he went straight to Optina. He was guided by Saints Leonid and Macarius, the latter of whom had him as a cell attendant. A cell attendant are the monks who were the closest to these elders and would take care of organizing the visitors for him, but they learned directly from them. And it was often from these cell attendants that they'd become the next elder. So St. Leonid was the first elder of the Optina Hermitage. St. Macarius took over after him. And after some time, St. Ambrose took over. So after 6 years there, he became very ill again. And he bore his illness without complaint, but it took him 2 years to recover. And then he could only walk with a cane. So when St. Macarius, again the second starets of that monastery, reposed, all the candidates to replace him soon reposed as well. And so St. Ambrose was the only one left, and he was the obvious choice. And so they had him take over. He spent much of his time in bed, very, very ill. And they describe in that book, Elder Ambrose of Optina, they describe his illnesses. I mean, horrible stomach pains, vomiting, chills, fever. I mean, it would go on for days and days and days sometimes. But as long as he had any strength whatsoever to do it, he would receive visitors. He rarely gave his opinion on anything, but would simply refer to the Holy Fathers. In fact, one of the famous things that he would do is he would, and the elder who took over after him, Joseph, would do this even more than him. But sometimes he would say, I'll be with you in a minute, but while you wait for me, why don't you read this book? And he'd open to a page, and the person would read it, and it was the exact answer to the question that they'd come to him for. This is very common. He would also give advice that people would then discover later in reading one of the lives or writings of saints was word for word what was written there. I mean, he wouldn't sit there and study it and memorize it, but there was such grace in it that he would say it word for word, and they'd go, sometimes weeks, months, years later and go, this is exactly what he told me. It's pretty incredible. He founded a women's convent not far from there that became very connected to Optina. He was visited, among other very famous visitors, by Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, for whom his grace-filled personality and counsel had a profound effect. Dostoevsky, that is. Dostoevsky went to him after his son had died, and he was in a deep depression. And meeting St. Ambrose actually got him out of that. So I want to read to you a paragraph from that article that I mentioned, and it describes a bit of St. Ambrose's life. It says, on the death of Starets Macarius in 1860, Ambrose was called to exercise a ministry that soon extended to the whole of Russia. Rich and poor, learned and unlettered, nobles and simple folk, noted members of the intelligentsia, they all made their way to this bedridden man as to a prophet newly risen up among them, seeking a word of counsel or of consolation in their distress, a word of salvation that was to order their entire life, a call to repentance or a simple blessing. Despite his physical weaknesses and his ailments, Ambrose received them all cheerfully and would adapt his manner and his words to each person, so that after conversing with the starets of Optina, the life of many of his visitors changed completely. People who spoke with him noticed how he could pass immediately from the discussion of high theology to the solution of practical problems of everyday life. Someone once criticized him one day for wasting his time advising a peasant woman how to properly feed her turkeys. His response was this. He said, don't you understand that her whole life is bound up with these turkeys, and that the peace of her soul is of no less account than that of those who come to me with questions about sublime matters? Amazing answer. Amazing. If her whole life is wrapped up in these turkeys, she needs advice from the turkeys. The writer Tolstoy visited the starets and was greatly edified. I did no more than converse with him, he wrote, and somehow my soul lost all heaviness. When you talk with such a man, you feel the nearness of God. Another writer speaks of an unfathomable abyss of charity within the saint whose love was extended to all. He would dictate answers to around 40 letters a day, often without even having opened the letters in the first place. This is very common for him, and many of the other elders would do this. They'd get a letter, no need to open it. He'd dictate this answer, and they'd send it off, and all the questions would be answered. He reposed in 1891, receiving visitors even to the very last hour of his life. It's absolutely incredible, incredible saint. And people would continue to flock. The elder who took over after him again was Saint Joseph of Optina, who was one of his closest disciples. And people were weeping and mourning, at the death of St. Ambrose, but they found that his spirit had indeed passed on to St. Joseph in many ways, and St. Joseph would give very, very similar advice. But St. Ambrose had prepared people for this. And the way he prepared them was, this shows you how powerful grace is, and that grace really instructs with those who are pure of heart. St. Ambrose would, somebody would come with a question and say, I think the answer for you is do this, 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 and this. But you know what? I'm not that lettered in this. Father Joseph has really read a lot more on this than I have. Why don't you go to him? And they'd go to him. Come on, I already received the answer from you. No, go to him. Go to him. Come on, he's nothing compared to you. Just go to him. And they'd go to Father Joseph, and Father Joseph would give, without having heard St. Ambrose's answer, he'd give word for word the same exact advice. And often, St. Ambrose would be seen with his cane standing in the background. And after the people, they'd be stunned and they'd look over and St. Ambrose would just be sitting there smiling. So this is how he prepared people to receive St. Joseph after him. So really, really just absolutely astonishing saints. I know I didn't mean to focus so much on Russian saints in this. There's been many others, but we'll do one more, and that's St. Ignatius Branchaninov. St. Ignatius Branchaninov was born on February 5th, 1807 in Russia. His mother gave birth to him after a prolonged infertility. And by her fervent prayers and travels to surrounding holy places, she became pregnant. Even as a child, St. Ignatius preferred solitude and prayer over playing with his friends and read many religious books. He was a great and brilliant student, and he excelled in school, but one by one, he rejected dedicating his life to various subjects. They kept saying, why don't you study this? Why don't you study this? And one by one, he said, I really don't want to do those things. Essentially what happened is, with the sciences, he was dissatisfied. Because, as he said, they could only describe the earth, but they couldn't describe the soul and the deeper longing within man. And those were more important questions to him. And then he looked at ancient and even modern philosophy, but he was dissatisfied with this. He said the human mind had not and could not answer the deepest and most important questions regarding the truth. All these great philosophers, they're coming to different conclusions. Wisdom can't be found here. Then he began to study more deeply the sacred scriptures. But even here he found a problem. He said, the scriptures are full of wisdom, but there's many and various interpretations which lend themselves to those who read the scriptures. And that means that the scriptures may have the answers, but I'm not going to be helped unless I find a guide. And that's when he discovered and began studying very, very cautiously and continually the writings of the church fathers. And by reading the church fathers, he found a sure guide to the scriptures, and this is where he found true wisdom. Though already having begun an illustrious career as an intellectual in the aristocratic life, at the age of only 20, even at 20, they recognized him as a great intellectual among the aristocrats. At the age of 20, he retired from this life. And what caused this? He had traveled to a very famous monastery. What monastery? Optina. And he met the first great elder there, St. Leonid. And his grace-filled personality and words filled him like nothing ever had before. And so he said, I want to dedicate my life to this. So he became a monk. Despite being a monk for only 5 years, his great progress in education caused the bishop to order him to rebuild and revive the Pleshensk Poltava monastery in the Vologda province, where 1 year later he was elevated to the position of abbot, very young. Not long after this, the Tsar, Nicholas I, elevated him to archimandrite, a priest-monk, and appointed him as abbot of the famous St. Sergius hermitage. He lived there for 24 years, though he was in constant illness and pain. This plagued him his entire life. He, like St. Ambrose, he had these constant illnesses and pains during his entire life. And so it was during these 24 years that he wrote the majority of his life's works. There's a book, oh boy, I didn't write down the name and I'm blanking on it. Harbor for Our Hope, I think is what it's called. And it's just selections of letters from him. And I haven't read the whole thing. I've read maybe 20%. The most common theme in it is how to deal with illness. You can tell where his state of mind was. He was constantly ill, constantly in pain. And he wrote about this constantly. In 1857, he was consecrated as bishop to the Caucasus and the Black Sea, though he became very seriously ill with smallpox. And so just 4 years into his episcopacy as bishop, he requested retirement, and he gave the final 6 years of his life to writing spiritual books. So why do I mention St. Ignatius Branchaninov? Well, the reason for this is because many of his works are being translated into English. And there's one that I believe I put on the list of the books to read for the first year after baptism, and that's called The Field. I think I did. Is on the top, is on the books to be read as a catechumen or the first year afterwards? First, okay. I'd switched that from last year only because so many people found it very heavy. And it is, it's dense. It's a dense book, but I have yet to find someone who's read it and has not been incredibly inspired by it. So it's one to go through slowly. You don't want to speed through that book. But it is so powerful. And some of the chapters in it, I go back to again and again and again. There's a follow-up to it called The Refuge, which I've only read a portion of. I haven't gotten through very much of it. And then his most famous book is called The Arena. And The Arena is kind of like his version of the Ladder of Divine Descent. It's a monastic guide, but it's become so popular that many lay people go and read it. And again, you have to put it in the proper context. Not all advice in it is for lay people, but there's still a lot of great wisdom and a lot of inspiration you can gain from it. So his works continue to be translated, but eventually Holy Trinity Monastery in Jordanville will translate his collected works. They're all well worth it, but The Field is one that I, again, read it slowly and enjoy it. It is so powerful. It is so inspiring. It's very convicting in many ways, but in a very good way. And St. Ignatius, and you'll see also his versatility as a writer when you read it. Some of the things are very theological, some are very ascetical, and some are like the most beautiful poetry. And you just get a really great sense of this great personality. So, okay, so we did that quicker than I was expecting. I'm glad about that. Those are the spiritual guides that we'll talk about next week. Well, what I'll do is I'll record this week. I'll record the very final lecture where I'll talk about a lot of great modern saints and elders, some that are much closer to our time and the influence that they've had. And then next week, please come with your questions, and we'll do a question and answer session. Which again, I'll record it. I may or may not post it. We'll see how it goes. But any questions for today? I realize going through Lives and Rites of Saints, there may not be a lot of questions, but if there are any, yes. Can I speak a little bit on obedience? Okay, yeah. So this is a pretty complex topic, actually. And the reason it's complex is because most of the writings we get about obedience come from monasteries and monastic saints. And monastic obedience is not the same as obedience that we find in the parish. You know, the parish can't be run like a monastery in that sense. For many of the monastics, they live obedience to a very, very extreme level. They live obedience to the letter as much as humanly possible. And the reason for that is not because we want in monasticism for people's lives to be controlled, but because in monasticism, the first thing you're doing is cutting off your own will. And so they'll get blessings before they have a sip of water in some monasteries. I mean, it is really, really tight. And it's very, very, it's a very specific type of obedience. Now, could that be lived in the parish? There's no way I have time for that. You know, that's never going to happen. But I'm not that type of a guide. You know, I'm a confessor. I'm not an elder. And that's how most parish priests are. You have to understand there's a difference. Although we use the terminology of spiritual father, the parish priest as a spiritual father is different from a spiritual father in a monastery setting. Okay? So because of that, when people come to me, there's very, very few times that I give specific obediences. I don't really do this a lot. I'll give advice, and you're free to follow it or not. Now, if you don't follow it, there may be consequences if there's significant problems with your spiritual life. If you can't fulfill certain advice, it means you're not really prepared for communion. And so there's not some sense I'm going to bar you from communion as a punishment. Rather, this is for your own safety. I have to guard the chalice and guard your own soul. But for the most part, what I do is I give advice and guidance. I don't really give obediences in that sense. So in a monastery, you're going to find a much stricter form of obedience than you will in the parish. But in the parish, are we not all seeking obedience to Christ? Of course we are. So this is one of the things that I have said to people, that if you're going to come for advice, but you never follow it, eventually I'm just going to say, maybe you need to confess to somebody else, because it doesn't seem that there's really any use to this. You know, it's, again, not as a punishment, but we have to take the spiritual life at least seriously enough that we really want to be seeking Christ. We want to be seeking the commandments. We want to be seeking purity of heart, and we want to be doing this together. And so again, I'm not going to call you to a specific obedience in that sense. Every now and then I might for a very specific reason. But the reality is my hope is that I can begin one day to really live a spiritual life that will inspire you. I can give you words that will inspire you, and mainly I can give you guidance from the saints that will make you want to live it on your own. And you don't really need the obedience in the same sense. Does that make sense? So please, like, I like when people want guidance in the spiritual life, but if you've just about finished your dinner and you don't want to waste the food, but you feel like one more bite is gluttony, please don't text me that question. Just use your discernment. Do what you can. There's no way. I can't live it like that. So. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Saint Anthony. Well, in a way, it wasn't, because he gave himself up to the will of God in this, and so since he wasn't martyred, but Saint Anthony had just such a fervor. It's funny. Even though he's not a martyr of the church, we still see the Desert Fathers and the monastics as, in a sense, martyrs. Why? Because they've killed off their own will. There's no egoism left in them, so they have committed their own type of martyrdom. But he had such a fervor for Christ. He thought, well, if there's persecutions going on, I don't want to be seen as hiding from those things, and I want to give my life wholly over to Christ. And so, if he wills that I be martyred, I'll go into the city and let it happen. But if not, what did he do? He went to those who were captured and were going to be martyred and brought them a lot of consolation and hope. And so he allowed himself to give over to it, but he didn't go and seek it in that sense, where it became an expression even of his own will there. So even that was done with caution. But again, what we get out of it is his extreme fervor for Christ. He had such a love for Christ. He wanted to give all to Christ, and if necessary, even his life. Yes? C.S. Tria? Mm-hmm.
So basically, like it gives a brief story of the
Ah, yes, okay. Yes.
So like for me, I couldn't really wrap my head. It's like I was like, I gotta be.
Yeah, yeah. Yes.
It just seems like a little bit.
Yeah. Okay, so the question is about those who have families and then leave to become a monk, and is that blessed or not? And the answer is that that's not allowed typically unless the person leaving has a blessing from their own spouse. And so you see this in some cases where people leave their spouse and want to go become a monastic. Sometimes they'll be sent back and say, no, not unless you get a blessing from your family. And this does happen sometimes, where there's a great piety and a love and within the family. They say, yes, we feel that you're called to this, and go. In fact, there's a great story on Mount Athos where a monk did have the blessing of his family. And so he left to become a monk, and after a while, he felt really tempted to go back. He felt like, I left my family, I shouldn't do this. And on his way back, an angel stopped him. Or, excuse, I ruined the story, sorry. A monk stopped him and said, what are you doing? And he said, well, I became a monk. I had the blessing of my wife to do this, but I just don't feel right. I feel like they're not going to be cared for, and so I'm going to go back. And then this monk revealed himself to be an angel and said, don't you know, I'm the angel who was sent to guard over your family, because this was a decision led by God and out of piety and not out of selfishness. And but if you're going back, I guess I can leave him. And he goes, no, you take care of him. You'll do a better job than I can. So it's really not to be done without a specific blessing from the family. Now, there are cases in the life of the church where there are special cases and special calls from God. One of my absolute favorites, it's one of my all-time favorite lives of a saint, is Saint Simeon the Full for Christ of Emesa. You can get this from Holy Transfiguration Monastery. It's a little book. It's not long, and it's hilarious. He was a great Full for Christ. He was a really amazing guy. But he and his fellow saint, Saint John left his wife, and Saint Simeon left his mother, and they didn't tell them. And people have read that, and they get a little scandalized by this. And I always tell them, this is not an everyday thing in the church. There was obviously, it doesn't go into it in the life. They don't really describe what it was, but it's very clear that there was a very special call from God at that time. Something happened to them that called them to this life. It wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision. But for those who don't have a really significant and powerful call from God for that, by all means, if the bishop finds out, or even the abbot, they're just going to send you right back. And there are plenty of stories where that's happened. You got to stay with her as long as she wants you. And then and when she's done, then she can send you off. So, Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay. So a lot of the saints that I talked, the question is about what about saints who are not monastics and not martyred, and what can we say about those? So obviously, the spiritual guides that I gave today are mainly from the monastic life. Why? Well, because that's where that holiness and that asceticism shines most brightly. There's a saying from Saint John Climacus that's been turned into an icon. It says, "Angels are the light for monastics, and monastics are the light for the lay people, or the laity." And this is so we can look at the monastics and say the spiritual life is the same for everyone. St. John Chrysostom says there's only one thing that separates the monastic from the lay Christian: virginity. That's the only thing that separates them. In everything else, we practice the same things. Now, the extent to which we practice them, it's going to be different. You can try to work after not sleeping all night, except for an hour leaning against the wall, but I don't think your work's going to go very well. So that's probably not for you. That's where you come to a confessor or spiritual father and get some guidance. Say what's the proper balance for me here? So we need to be balanced in the spiritual life. But are there saints who are not monastics and who are not martyrs? There are a lot of them. A lot of them. Um, there are innumerable holy figures. So there's a book that again, I haven't read the whole thing yet. I've been told it's fantastic. It's called Ascetics in the World, I think, or Ascetics Living in the World. It says volume 1, but I don't think a second volume has been published yet in English. But that's all about saints who are living in the world, many of whom were married. You can also find from Dr. David Ford and his wife. There's a book, and again, I don't remember the name of it, but it's all about it's just Synaxarian short readings, and it goes through the entire year. It goes in chronological order. It's just married saints. Now, many of them, after their children were grown, would go to monasteries and become monastics themselves, but many did not. And so you can find many, many cases. In fact, probably one of the most famous examples is we talked last time about Saint Basil and his brother Saint Gregory of Nyssa. Their whole family were monastics. Their dad, their mom, their brothers, sorry, not monastics, saints. They're all saints. Eventually, his mother did become a nun, but the reality is sanctity was born within the family at that point. And in fact, if you look at the three, what we call the three hierarchs, Saint Gregory the theologian, Saint John Chrysostom, and Saint Basil, all three of their mothers are saints of the church. So you can find this again and again and again throughout the life of the church. But the reality is that that holiness shines most brightly, as St. Paul talks about, with those who don't have the responsibility of family life, and they can dedicate themselves more fully. And so again, it shines forth very brightly there. But are there saints like this? Absolutely, there are. I'll tell you one more to look at. A lot of people don't realize during the Boxer Rebellion in China, there were many Orthodox Christians who were killed, martyrs of them. And you can find among the saints of the Boxer Rebellion, even children saints. Some really incredible stories from them. And there are many, many child saints. So if you search, you'll find them. And there's plenty. There are absolutely plenty of saints from every walk of life, from emperors to complete paupers, monastics and married, old and young. I mean, it runs the gamut. You can find saints.
How would like sin? How would it determine? Because like I've heard, oh, I'm not saying it.
Yeah. Okay. So
What does that look like in terms of
yeah.
all the sort of
So essentially, how is a saint officially glorified? We use the word canonized. I like the term glorified better. I don't remember if I talked about this really early on, but maybe I didn't. In Roman Catholicism, it's a very top-down process. That's the one that most people are familiar with, where the Vatican will make a committee that then looks into the lives of these figures. They look at the writings and lives. They investigate to find out if officially 2 miracles have happened. I mean, it's a very structured process. In the Orthodox Church, it's a very bottom-up process. It's very organic. And so typically what will happen is often while someone is still alive, they'll be recognized for their holiness, and after they die, a popular veneration will start to pop up. Now, that veneration has to happen in the proper boundaries. So you can't go do services to that person. You shouldn't be making icons of them and things like that. But it often happens anyway, if it's really obvious. Once the popular veneration, the typical time is about 50 years, because we don't like to be too hasty. But with some, it's just so obvious. like Saint Paisios of Mount Athos, Saint Porphyrios, Saint Jacobos of Evia. These are all very modern saints. It was so obvious. It was so obvious even during their lives that no one thought we needed to wait. So popular veneration had already grown up or popped up, and then locally the bishop will create a synod to essentially look at the cause for glorification, and if they find no reason not to, and that we don't have the same requirement that you have to approve, you have to find approved and proven miracles in that case. But then they'll have a service of glorification where we officially stop asking or saying prayers for the saint and instead start asking intercessions of the saint. In many cases, this will happen with people only after they've died, because during their life they remained so hidden and they were so humble. But after they die, miracles will start happening at their graves, and this has happened as well throughout the life of the church. But again, it's a very organic process. It's really a bottom-up type of process in the Orthodox Church.
So if the saint seems like very normal. The other like Russian basically.
Yes. So this I don't fully understand. So I've never really looked too deeply into this. The question is like, if a saint is locally glorified, is that for the whole entire church? And sometimes what will happen is while a local synod may glorify the saint, then they get another glorification by the patriarch or in some other location. So that does happen. But if a saint is already glorified in one area, anyone can really venerate them. And I think because of our modern technology, this is happening a lot more, where a saint is becoming known throughout the whole world much more quickly than it used to happen. So like you go to Romania to see Saint Nectarius' icon, or even Saint John of San Francisco. Very, very, like when I went to Romania last time, people asked me about Saint John of San Francisco. Have I been to his relics? And I give them oil. I brought some oil from his vigil lamps, and they get very excited because they know him now. And although he was everywhere, we'll talk about him in the next one, but he kind of went all over the place. But again, that local veneration is becoming it's becoming known much more quickly because of the internet. It's really as simple as that. Yeah, I didn't. So in the next lecture, I'll talk about Father Seraphim Rose. So I'll talk about St. John of San Francisco, and at the end I give just a little blurb about Father Seraphim Rose. And his cause for veneration has become very, very strong recently, so there's a good chance he'll be glorified rather soon. So, and now I did say, just to mention this, it's really, we're cautious about people venerating somebody before they've been officially glorified by the church. At the same time, sometimes it's so obvious. Like Elder Ephraim of Arizona, I know people with icons or pictures of him all over the place. I have pictures of him in my house, in my office. It's just so obvious. Even during his lifetime, there were other holy figures who were alive who were like, this is like one of the greatest saints that we've had in a long time. And I'll tell you just a personal story about this. Then there are some who are not as well known, but you just kind of trust certain things. And so when I was in Romania last time with my family, we went to my favorite monastery. It's the most beautiful monastery I've ever seen, Rametz Monastery. It's a women's monastery. And the former abbess there, Mother Jerusalema, I'm not sure if she's still alive now, honestly. She had retired after being abbess for many, many years. And she was speaking to me in Romanian. My wife was translating. And she gave us two pieces of advice. She said, have as many children as God gives you. And if you have a son, you will name him Dometia, after my great spiritual father. And her spiritual father, Father Dometia, is buried there. And we went to his grave. He guided the nuns at the time that the communists shut the monastery down and forced them all to get secular jobs. And he continued to guide them. He was a man who just simply taught people how to pray. That was his main thing. He wasn't known for being a great miracle worker. He wasn't known for any great wonders. He was known for teaching people how to pray. But veneration was very strong. And so we were like, well, should we name a child after someone who's not officially glorified? Well, this nun who seems very holy told us to do it, so we're like, okay. So we named him Dometia. And so right now, we use the name Saint Domitius of Persia, is a saint commemorated in August. But Romania has, the Romanian Church has declared that they will glorify Father Dometia, I think in 2025, along with Elder Cleopa and others. And so we're like, okay, we'll just kind of make the switch then. So we already have an icon that we had hand painted of Father Dometia. So there's a time and a place, but you have to be careful with that. You have to be a little cautious about that. So do be cautious about just putting other figures up at your icon corner. There should be some sort of sense within the church already that they're moving in that direction. And there have been times, by the way, where synods or patriarchates have intervened and said, there's a popular veneration of this figure, don't. Because sometimes there are deceptions. Sometimes there are deceptions. You have to be cautious. Okay. All right. Any last question? Okay. I'm glad I finally, for once, left time for questions. I will record session 14, and then next week, please do come prepared with questions, and we'll try to fill up at least an hour with questions and answers. All right. May God bless and keep you.